Welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. So today I'm here with Belal from Death to Fluff. How's it going? How's your day?
I'm very well, Dustin. Thanks for having me on the show, man. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. I mean, I'm a newish role here, VP of Revenue, former marketer. So I'll be jotting notes and getting some sales tips from you here for sure. I want to dive right into it. So the first thing that stood out to me on your LinkedIn was your little audio note, right at the top, where you say quota achievements down, rep tenures down, turnovers up. It's time for change. Like, what's causing that and what needs to change?
Yeah, and I mean, I think in my sales career that I've done better when I've been just a realist than an optimist.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of sellers, maybe they try to psych themselves into believing things are going great when they're not. And I found elite sellers don't do that at all. They're very real, very pragmatic in their approach, they're very ruthless with their time. And if I apply that to the sales profession at large, I see the same kind of symptoms. Like there's a lot of sales bro culture and excitement and things of that nature that happens maybe internally in a sales org. But in reality, if you look at the state of sales across all these different reports, like that come out from Outreach and Sales Loft and Bridge Group and so on, key metrics in sales have been declining and like consistently declining for the last half decade. Like the ones you listed, rep turnover, quota attainment, buyer satisfaction, number of touches that a rep has to do to get meaningful engagement. All these metrics are trending in the wrong direction. And it's like the state of sales and these reports typically aren't SaaS specific. So it's not like you could say, oh, this is something happening in SaaS. Like this is manufacturing, this is pharma, this is like across the board, transcending space and time.
Yeah.
There's failure, like, and there's a decline in the sales profession. So the question becomes, well, why? Especially when it, like, for me, the like kind of the golden indicators that it's not industry specific. So that must be something universally flawed in what's happening in sales today. And if you look at the commonalities of sales, no matter what you sell, who you sell to, there's some very common things like quota. Quota is like a baseline of every seller's existence. There's things like activity metrics that are being tracked. There's things around, pressures around commissions and revenue and some of the gamesmanship that companies do around those sort of things. All of that are the kind of common causes of, or sort of the underlying issues. And those symptoms are what we're seeing in those state of sales reports. That's not the cause, right? There's something underlying going on in sales where what we were doing before simply isn't working anymore. Like it's become less effective. And if everybody's going to keep trying to do it the same way that they did 10, 20 years ago, it's clearly not going to work.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that is literally a definition of insanity, right? It's just trying the same thing over and over again. And I think we're seeing that in marketing as well, in the marketing community with like this demand gen push and, switching away from just spam some Google ads and, run a bunch of campaigns and stuff that doesn't really work long term. So I know, your whole angle here and what you believe in is death to fluff. So what is the fluff that is really causing this?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a broad question. It's one of those ones where we'd love there to be like one or two really simple answers to it all, but in
Yeah.
reality, it's like 50 different answers that all fractionally add up to the total. But I'll share some of the bigger ones that people should be contemplating where they could make hopefully a substantial shift.
Mhm.
One is just the way buyer preferences work now. Um, the reality is, and actually Matt Dixon just released his Jolt method or Jolt effect book, and it talks about indecision. And one of the things that he talks about is indecision versus status quo bias and how people buy. For the longest time, we just been programmed as marketers, as sellers, to sell against the status quo. And that's true, and that's still valid. Nothing has changed there. But now there's this additional layer of indecision that happens because in the last 3 years, the amount of people involved in buying something has gone up.
Mhm.
People can't make straight up decisions. Now, this is not universally applicable. Like there's still plenty of stuff you could sell to a single decision maker. But in general, there seems to be a trend in the number of people involved in buying and purchasing decisions.
Yeah.
That's number one. And number two, because there's more people involved, there's more misinformation or confusion that happens with that because everybody has their own opinion and perspective when they get involved into a buying decision. And that convolutes and clouds judgment and makes things, and eventually reach a point where sometimes indecision wins the deal.
Mhm.
Like people are sold that the status quo shouldn't work anymore, that they need to change, but to change to what is too hard of a decision to make. So they defer, they defer, they defer. And so if you really want to make an impact, those are the two things I would say you need to realize. Number one, the amount of people involved in the decision has gone up. And number two, the amount of like confusion that happens because of that has gone up. And buyers and marketers that can navigate that decision and make that part of their either their sales process or marketing funnel are going to see better returns on their investment of their time and resources than those that don't.
Yeah, and I think this is an overly simplified question coming your way, and I know there's no answer. But like, what does a seller do? Like, my mind immediately goes to the poke the bear, kind of pique interest, get people thinking, rather than just pitching and running them through your sales process. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, and that's it. I mean, you have to become a provocative seller. Like
Mhm.
provocation is a superpower for a seller or marketer to be doing nowadays. And provocation comes from limbic brain messaging, focusing on emotionally charging your messaging and picking a very clear enemy that your buyer can rally behind, that you can rally behind, and attacking that enemy and making kind of an us versus them thing. And this is really effective. It's core psychology, stuff that before it's not like that didn't matter 10 or 20 years ago. It's just you didn't need to know as much of it as you do now. Like you could be like when I look at my emails that I used to send when I was a little wee SDR 12 years ago, that worked back then. That was acceptable. If I sent the exact same email today, it would not work. It'd be completely ineffective. It's just the bar keeps getting raised, or maybe the tolerance of the buyers keeps going down. Their level of patience goes down. Their expectations are higher. So there's something about provocation, about creating artificial constraints for people to choose from. The world is either this or that. Which side do you want to be on? And people seem to gravitate towards that kind of messaging. They gravitate towards strong opinions, something that's emotionally charged.
Yeah, the thing I really like about that is it aligns with marketing as well, right? Like you're kind of describing like a strategic narrative type approach to sales,
Yes.
right? Like the bad guy, us versus them. What's the big change in the world? So on the sales and marketing alignment side, like it's one thing for sellers to do that, but if marketing's not kind of beating the same drum and warming them up, I think it makes sellers' lives way, way harder.
It does. It does. If the message isn't the same, whether that's a cold email, an ad running on LinkedIn, the sales deck, all that sort of stuff needs to align. There needs to be a theme. Now,
Mm.
each thing I just listed has its own medium, so the medium changes how the message is wrapped or displayed or done. But the theme of the message should be identical throughout. Whatever it is that you're picking as an enemy. And I've got an example of this because I've been a part of 7 different startups. At each of them, I was one of the first sales hires. So we had to figure this out. We were competing with behemoths in every single one. At TriNet, we were competing against ADP. At Connectify, we were competing against LinkedIn. At Full Story, we were competing against IBM. It's like the big names. And even with like a dominant player that has massive market share, we're still able to carve out our piece of the world by just being provocative, by just, again, picking at common enemy and creating the narrative around it of like, here's why, even though you have these options in the market, you're still not happy. You're still not solving what you wanted to solve. Here's a potential other path. Did you ever consider this?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll play devil's advocate, even though I agree with what you're saying, just to, say what people might think, right? So I think some people would say, yeah, but if you go too provocative, it's not direct enough or concise enough. Um, I don't necessarily agree with that, but yeah, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, you could be direct and provocative. You could be provocative and not be direct. Like there's absolutely combinations of the two.
Mhm.
When I think of provocative, I think about again forcing people to pick a lane, forcing people to pick a lane. And sometimes those two options aren't necessarily good versus evil kind of things. It could just be two different ways of thinking about a problem. So an example of this would be like at Full Story, where we used to sell session replay to product people
Mhm.
and also to their engineering teams as an add-on. We just told people very simply, you either want to know what's going on your website or you want a random sample. Now, if you want to be the people do the random sampling, that's going to dictate a lot about what you see. If you're the sort of person that wants to see everything going on your website, aggregate that and then act upon it, That's a very different camp. You can't have both. You either go one way or the other, and which lane you pick is going to determine the outcomes you get. Who are you? And we forced people to into that kind of binary choice of A or B. And we found some people liked A and some people like B. I wasn't judgmental. I was like, look, I mean, if you want to be in camp A, which is not our camp, that's fine.
Mhm.
But I got nothing for you. So you might as well just hang up the phone now, wish
Yeah.
you the best, good luck, and let me know how it goes. You've got my number if things change. But if you are leaning towards camp B and you want to see how that's going to work, I guess something pretty interesting here.
Yeah, and I think so this ties to something I saw you post about a couple weeks ago or something where, you said it's not a seller's job to convince people to buy, and that's kind of the same idea there, right? Like you're presenting the options. I found that post funny because my very first sales interview, it was not in SaaS. It was like selling for Nestle, which is a bit different, right?
Yeah, yeah.
First interview, holds up the pen, sell me this pen.
Oh God, not
Yeah,
that.
yeah, no, exactly, right? So I agree
Oh,
with your message, but for those who, maybe aren't that familiar with this, what do you mean by it's not, a seller's job to talk people into buying things?
yeah. I mean, when you put yourself in that situation where you're trying to persuade somebody else, just think about it. Just even like normal circumstances, you're already at a disadvantage. You're making
Yeah.
them play defense. You're on offense. You're trying to finagle and make this point, and they're not budging, and they're going to start poking holes in it. Or what if you kind of did some reverse psychology, defended the status quo, defended why something that's wrong shouldn't be changed, and then kind of let them tell you, well, I don't think that. I actually do think there are problems. I know that my world isn't perfect and peachy, and I do think there's room for improvement. And you go, well, tell me more about that. Tell me why you think that. And a lot of this actually goes back to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This, like for me as a seller, I've done 7 different sales trainings, Dustin. I've done the Winning by Design, Sandler, and
Yeah.
Challenger, and all this good stuff. And all of them are great. All of them taught me really useful things. But the stuff that made the biggest impact in my sales career came from outside of traditional sales training. And one of them is my wife studies addiction studies. She's got a master's degree in it. And she opened my world to like cognitive behavioral therapy. And we've been like, those researchers have been doing that for like 40, 50, 60 years. Like CBT has been around for a very long time. And it's the way we take somebody that has an addiction, getting them to acknowledge it, admit that they have a problem, commit to making change, and then taking the steps necessary. And it's the same thing in buying and selling. Like when you're doing elite selling, you're aligning to people's desire for some aspirational goal that today they can't get to. And that's a much better position at the end than trying to tell them why they should have bigger aspirations. Like again, if you're
Yeah.
trying to persuade them that's a very hard thing to do, time consuming thing to do.
Well, yeah, and I think speaking of psychology there, like people don't like to be persuaded and have their mind changed in that right way, right? Like if you tell someone they're doing it wrong, they're just gonna dig their feet into the sand deeper, really fight you back. And that sucks for the seller. It sucks for the buyer. Like it's just a negative experience kind of across the board.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a waste of time because it ends up being a no decision, status quo, ghosted me type ending for the deal cycle. And you look back and you're like, wow, that's, 3 weeks or 3 months or however long it took that I'd love to get back. And you can't
Yeah,
because time is the one thing you can't recoup.
for sure. Yeah, and I think I want to dive a little deeper into the psychology thing just because my undergrad was in psych. It was something I
Nice.
took it because it was interesting, right? Like honestly, there's not many jobs with a psych degree, but it worked out. Like it's useful in sales and marketing. But what are some other, kind of principles that you use when you're crafting your messaging there?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I think a lot about, again, limbic brain messaging, like words that we don't use in our daily language that's going to get people to snap awake and feel alert. And of course, the FOMO, the fear of missing out. And the thing that people struggle with is great messaging is actually the absence of your product. We're cursed with knowledge. We get so obsessed about our product.
Yeah,
We think about it day in and day out. And so we're always thinking about benefits. So what do you gain? We had a customer achieve, our companies that use our service were able to, things of that nature is pretty much plastered on any website that you look at. And it's like, well, it's actually the inverse. It's what you really want to be saying is, had this customer not bought us, they would have lost the chance to achieve. They would have missed out on. You will not be able to blank when you don't use blank. And that's really powerful messaging when you create that like kind of negative connotation to it, then absence of it. And we're just driven as human beings to avoid loss. We're risk averse by our nature. We don't want to make mistakes. We don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want things to go wrong. We don't want to miss out. We don't want to be the last ones out on anything. And that's deeply rooted in our psychology. But again, it's one thing to say, it's another thing when you go pen to paper, or, like get on your keyboard to type that email or that copy, because you're cursed with knowledge and you're obsessed with your product. So you're starting on a non-level playing field with your buyer already. And you got to bring yourself back down, kind of like remove all that knowledge that you have in your head or park it to the side. That's very challenging for us to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've run into that a bunch. So like one little trick I do there, even if you don't have, friend, colleague, someone who is your buyer who you could run the messaging by, is I actually just ask my wife, does this make sense? She's a nurse, so she knows a whole lot of stuff I don't, but she's not a marketing or salesperson.
That's perfect.
If I send her something and she's like, I have no clue what the hell this word is, like, what is this acronym? It's gone. So I think that's, little tricks like that I find help. And also just reading your message out loud. Like if it sounds like you wrote it, it might not work. If it sounds like conversational, something you're saying, you're probably closer to the right track. So
Yeah.
that's more of the
Yeah.
marketing side, but those have helped me for sure.
Oh yeah, I'm with you. Like whenever I'm doing like a messaging teardown or something like that, I go straight to the review sites. And if that company doesn't have reviews, I'll go to their competitors. Somebody's got a review in that space, right? Like somebody's
Yeah.
sold this product before. And I just read that review. And if it says something that they loved, I go, okay, so what did they hate?
Yeah.
That thing that they now love, like superseded or took over or allowed them to do. And I'll start there. So again, I'm always inversing, and I remind myself constantly of one of the greatest ads in history, which is the Got Milk ad. It's an ad about the absence of the product. you know,
Yeah.
it's the classic Cookie Monster sitting in front of a pile of cookies with an empty glass of milk, and he's sitting there slumped, frowning, and it's like Got Milk, and I'm like, brilliant! It's the absence of the product, and yet it's one of the most effective ads ever done.
100%. I like that, looking at the message and inverting it. So, we don't use Gong, we use Wingman, but similar type tools where you can listen to sales calls. And a lot of the time, sales or customer success calls, they frame it in the positive, like, I'm looking to achieve X. So I think that's a really useful tip for people who are listening to those calls to, like you said, figure out what the inverse is and what they're potentially missing out on. I'm going to steal that one as I redo website copy. So for the listeners, like, I do think that's a really important one.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's not natural. So don't feel
Yeah.
like upset with yourself if you're doing it and it's not quite working right. We are naturally inclined to be self-centered, to be egocentric, to think about the world from our perspective, from our product, from whatever it is that we're doing. And in order to do this, you have to step out of that. You have to actually like be very premeditated, very concentrated to step out of that mindset and say to yourself, okay, if I didn't have this, why is that a problem? And essentially what harm am I being led to by not having this thing, whatever it is, it's a product or a service.
Yeah, no, exactly. I assume that gets way easier with time though, as you practice that and you do it a whole bunch.
It gets easier, but I'll tell you what, I was just recently had to go to market for GTM Buddy, and I was funny. I was writing the copy for the website. And I was like, God, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I am still just gravitating towards the same kind of generic messaging that I know won't work. And yet every time I look up, I've typed that generic messaging again and again. So that's
Yeah.
why outside perspective really does help. Like you have your wife, like that really makes a huge difference, because the analogy I give is like, if you're in an airplane, right? And the pilots of that airplane typically have tens of thousands of hours of training to do what they do. No matter what airport you land at in the world, that airplane, for just a brief moment, the full control of it's given to some person on the ground with some glow sticks. And that person with glow sticks has maybe a couple dozen hours of training. And yet
Yeah.
this person with all their knowledge and all their experience listens to that person with glow sticks when they say left, right, stop. Why? Perspective. Because that person with glow sticks can see the whole plane and the pilot sitting in it and can't. So like that's the power of perspective. Like you might know everything, but it still helps to talk to somebody, especially if that person maybe doesn't know as much as you do. It gives them a lot of perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I worked at a company where, instead of calling rabbit hole in a meeting, like when you go off topic, we would just call marketing speak. If someone pitched a copy idea and God forbid the word synergy or something was included in it.
Yeah.
Like it was just a
And
BS call out, right? Like, nope, marketing speak, get rid of it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's deadly. It's deadly.
So I do want to switch gears a bit, like, you know, the general economy, it's different right now. It's especially in tech, it's kind of crazy out there. So
Yeah.
like what advice would you give for sellers and marketers there? Because I think now more than ever, budgets cut, resources cut, you kind of have to do more with less. For our listeners, it's October 2022, if you're listening back to this, but yeah, I would love your thoughts on maybe what needs to change in this time.
Well, I'm going to start with something maybe a little bit unorthodox, so forgive me for this, but like, it's not your fault if your company did a bad job planning capacity, setting unrealistic expectations at the start of the year, and now all of a sudden you have to be some wizard and come up with, essentially magic to make things work. And you're not crazy for thinking that stuff is wrong. Um, there's sellers out there right now that have quotas that on a good year they wouldn't even hit, let alone on a year like this. There's marketers out there with expectations put on their back to solve a mountain of problems, and it's just not realistic for any human to do so. And they've got an economic downturn potentially, to deal with. So there's a bit of that, and I think it's good just to accept that like some of that's just not your fault. It's not your fault. It is your problem, but you're not crazy for thinking it's wrong. You're not crazy for thinking some of the expectations were wildly off to begin with.
Mhm.
Now you still got to deal with it all the same. And what I really would recommend is go back to like basic human instinct. Okay. Basic human instinct right now is to kind of play defense. All right.
Mhm.
So if your messaging is not aligning to that and you're asking people to play offense in a time when everybody's thinking defensively, it's probably not going to resonate. It's probably not going to resonate. So you really got to make a shift to say to yourself, can I in any way, shape or form realign this message to somebody who's thinking defensively, who's thinking really risk averse, who's thinking the last thing I want to do right now is make a big mistake because that's mud on my face. I'm going to be the one holding, the bag at the end of that. And it's going to be my head on the chopping block potentially if the mistake is big enough. So that is really core at this moment in time to like double down on and align your message to that kind of mindset. And if you can even use that kind of language in your messaging, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with like putting the elephant, like just talking about the elephant in the room
Yeah.
and just sounding informed. Like I know now is a great time to play defense and not make mistakes, make every single dollar count.
Mhm.
Where do you see that being the best place to do so right now? Because anything that can protect margins that you've already established is a good thing. You're going to be heralded for that because you're playing defense.
For sure. Yeah. And I think a good kind of marketing example of a company that did that well recently was Metadata. Like they were very much, drive revenue, drive revenue, drive revenue, and then realize, okay, we need to focus on efficiency. And that is our messaging and, getting more with less, and really made that switch, which is interesting. I think larger companies might struggle with that though, changing messaging at a large company and pivoting.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
Almost impossible, like just the red tape you have to go through to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, for smaller companies, for sure, like you've got to make a shift right now and you've got to go back to again, basic human instinct. And like I prefer Tony Robbins' Six Human Needs because the guy has like data from literally millions of people
Yeah.
that he's worked with over time. So it's very well validated. And I look at those six human needs. I'm like, where can our product align to this for the ideal persona at the companies that we sell to? Which human need are they thinking about right now? Can we align our messaging to one of those human needs? So if it's like a desire of being wanted at this sort of moment, to feel important in this economic downturn that they can play a commercial strategic role in the company. What in our product feature set messaging can we align to that human need right now? That's a great way to approach this. And again, knowing that they're playing defense, tell them, hey, I know you're probably thinking about this right now. Here's a great way to do so.
For sure. No, I think that's good advice. And I like how you started with, just kind of acknowledging the situation a little bit. And I'm curious on your thoughts on this because, obviously this isn't great for salespeople's or marketing people's mental health, right? It's stressful. You still have these crazy quotas and targets. And so let's say you're leading sales at a company, you're getting all that pressure on, let's hit this unachievable goal. what do you do there? Like, what do you do to help the people?
I talked to Todd Caboni about this, the author of The Transparency Sale, and I asked him this exact question because I didn't know myself. I was like, Todd, what do we do right now?
Yeah.
How do you manage this? He shared with me an interesting story, and I'll share with your listeners. And it's in his new book. He wrote a book about transparency management. And there's a lot of psychology research that he's done on this. And the story he shares is in Japan, for death row inmates, one of the things that they do is they don't tell them the date of their of when they're going to be executed. Okay.
Huh.
And the death row inmates in Japan were actually able to sue the government and win in the Supreme Court that not telling them the date of their death was inhumane. So it was more inhumane treatment to not tell them the date of their death than it was to put them on death row, because the uncertainty was like a stressful killer, like unreasonable, undue stress for those inmates. And it's the same thing with us. Like when we're dealing with uncertainty, the stats are in that our IQ literally drops percentage points while we feel that stress of uncertainty. We're unable to focus. We're unable to stay motivated. We're more likely to suffer from mental health issues, maybe depression and things of that nature. So even if the news is bad, it's better to be transparent about it and give somebody bad news than to be non-transparent about it. And it's the same thing. Like I totally got it when he was describing, because I'm like, it's the same thing for me when I go to a doctor and they tell me what's wrong with me. Even if what they told me was wrong for me is severe, I'm just glad that I know what it is now, because now there's a chance
Yeah.
to treat it. But if I go to the doctor, they go, I have no clue what's wrong with you. I freak out even more because I'm like, if you don't know, who's going to know? Like, somebody better figure this out. Like, I got to know what's going on. So in the same way, if you're a sales leader, a VP of marketing, a marketing leader right now, you've got a team and things are not going well, it's better to actually be transparent about that and say, look, we're not going to hit goal.
Mhm.
Okay. The numbers, it's math. The numbers don't add up. That's okay. Now we need to make do with what we have. And that's an easier pill to swallow than if you tried to hide that and cause more stress with uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that probably the hardest part I would think for sales leaders is the managing up there and talking to the rest of the exec team and, flatly laying out the scenario. Cause let's say company X just took 400 mil in funding and they expect to grow at this rate. And, it's just not going to happen now. How do you convince them that there's this new reality? And that can be tough. Like, it's just a difficult conversation.
It is. And the numbers don't lie. And
Yeah.
the thing about sales and marketing is it's very clearly number driven, whether it's funnel metrics or pipeline metrics and things of that nature. And it's very easy to tell people based on historical data, based on where we are right now, we're not going to hit plan. Now, there's either one or two options. Either we panic, burn everything to the ground, and hope to God that's going to solve things, which we all know it's not. Or we say, okay, look, this is the situation. What's the best case scenario we can make out of it? And that sort of pragmatic leadership, people gravitate towards that because in times of uncertainty, in times of risk, we gravitate to stability. So the best thing you can do when managing up as a sales leader or marketing leader is to provide stability, is to show that, look, we might miss, but at least we could do it in a calm, reasonable fashion. Let's do a soft landing instead of a hard landing and just blow up.
Yeah.
Like we can still bring this to a reasonable point, but I need you to know, again, transparency, what we've set out is not going to be accomplished. The map just isn't there.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to argue with the numbers, right? And I think the companies, maybe I'm biased because, I'm in a revenue role where it's marketing and sales, but I think the companies that are more aligned there and realized, now's the time to maybe not spend more, but do more in marketing and build up that demand for 2023 when hopefully things get back to normal. I think those are the ones that are going to do well, and rather than the ones who just pull everything back and, basically hide in a bunker and try to wait this out. That's a tough call to make though. Like,
It
let's
is.
create more stuff. Let's play the long game. But I think those are the ones that are really going to come out of this better.
It is. It is hard to do, but it's like you said, like the sun will rise.
Yeah.
There will be a point where this comes out. Do you want it with half the team and a third of the budget, or would you rather be in a position where you're able to stabilize things somewhat? Yes, of course, some things need to be dialed back, but you don't lose all momentum to the extent where you're almost at a restart when things come back to normal. That's the worst position to be in.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's, getting off the treadmill and then trying to hop on while it's going full speed and catching up to people. Not going to happen. Cool. And then I want to ask, one last question, I guess. We went a little, I won't say sad there, but realistic, right? Like a little pessimistic. So to bring it out, like, what are you looking forward to in the new year? Like, what are you really excited about?
Well, I'm really, I think first off, one of the things that's a growing trend right now in sales is actually um, AI writing messaging. And
Mm,
it's surprisingly pretty good. Like,
yeah.
if you were going to rate emails on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like the Mona Lisa of emails and one being like complete garbage, most people typically write on average at a 3 or 4, maybe a 5 at the most. These like email tools can write already at like a 3 level, 4 level right out the gate. And
Mhm.
the more data they get, the more the algorithms can be trained better and so on. We're going to see that jump up to a 5 or a 6. Now, the thing about it, Dustin, is like the difference between like a really good email and a great email is marginal. The difference between
Yeah.
a really bad email and a good email is exponential, right?
Yeah.
So like the gains diminish over time, but those early gains are the best.
Mhm.
So I don't think people need to. It'll be interesting to see because I don't think these tools are going to go away anytime soon. I think they're going to keep getting better. And then the question becomes, well, where does the human element come in? And that's things like video. That's things like personalization. That's things like putting a face to the name. Because at the end of the day, people still like to buy from people.
Mhm.
We sometimes really do need to talk to somebody. And the companies that realize that and start building the revenue teams into sort of like subject matter experts that aren't there again to hard sell, but just to provide context about the industry space and software that they live and breathe. Those are the ones that are going to win. So, and my experience, elite sellers already do this kind of intuitively. They're very forward with bringing up competition. They're very forward with bringing up information that a buyer didn't ask for because they're like, I do this all day. You don't. So let me
Yeah.
handle this part. Let me elevate the conversation for you.
Yeah, that's an interesting point on AI. Like, I think I saw yesterday, the day before, Jasper AI raised some
Yeah.
ridiculous amount of money, 120 million or
Huge.
something. And
Yeah.
I remember I was in their beta when they first started, and like it was pretty good. And then now, just how quickly it got better.
Yeah.
uh, It's a little creepy thinking about the robots writing messages, but it is what it is, right?
It's not going to stop. So get on
Yeah.
board with it. Don't swim against the current. That's been my experience working at startups. I'm not one to swim against the current. I will go with it. And now it's the
Yeah.
question of, okay, now what can I add to that? And if I could put a face to the name, people will still buy because they see me, even though if it's not my words. They still want to
Yeah.
know that a human was somewhere involved in that. And I'll play that part.
Yeah. And I think the like one last point here, I think the subject matter expert part is huge because there's people on LinkedIn like yourself, right, who are subject matter experts on particular topics. Makes your life a lot easier to sell. If you even if it's a marketer, like up next on this, I have Nick Bennett, for example. He's the next guest on the
Nice.
podcast. If he DMs someone and says, "Hey, let's talk about Alice," and it's a marketer, they're probably going to take the call.
They
So
will.
there's so much value in that, personal brand. I know some people hate that word, but just sharing your thoughts and building in public.
Oh yeah, there's such and you know what it comes down to is that people that do the personal branding or are experts in that, what they do is they amalgamate information that you
Yeah,
would suffer to sift through, that you would suffer to try to figure out on your own. And in today's world, that sort of like aggregation is one of the most is the superpower nowadays because there's
yeah,
so much information out there. It's so easy to get misled. It's so easy to get distracted and think you're reading something that is important and find out later that it's not or not as relevant as you thought it was.
yeah.
And that's going to be the future. Is like B2B companies understand that and start embracing that aspect. And again, having their frontline people behave that way, it's going to attract buyers because buyers right now are just overloaded. Overloaded. And that's why indecision, according to Matt Dixon, going back full circle to where we started, is probably going to grow as a reason why people don't buy.
Yeah. No, 100%. I know my inbox, having just started a new job, is overloaded with the same message. So tying that back to provocative messaging and just, breaking through that noise is super important. Well, I definitely learned a few things. I'm going to borrow from here. If our listeners want to learn more, connect with you, where do they go?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I've got a newsletter, death2fluff.substack.com. You can sign up there. Those are two places where I'm at. Feel free to message me. I was open. DMs are
Cool.
open.
Yeah, I'll throw those in the episode description. And thank you, man. I enjoyed the conversation. It was fun.
Likewise, thank you, Dustin.
Yeah. All right. Take care.